Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Vijay Karmaji. I'm a Principal Database Solutions Architect here at AWS, and I specialize in MySQL database engines, including Aurora and RDS MySQL. With me today, my colleague Krishna Sarabu. He is specialized in Postgres database engines, including Aurora and RDS Postgres. During our session today, if you have any questions, feel free to post your questions in the chat. We will address them as we go along. So let's get started. So for today's agenda, we're going to cover a quick overview of Amazon RDS multi-AZ with 2 readable standbys. And then we're going to cover performance benefits of multi-AZ with 2 readable standbys. And also, we're going to cover the 2 new features, inbound and outbound replicas. And then we will end the session with a demo. Amazon RDS provides 2 options for high availability and failover support for DB instances. The first one, with the deployment with 1 standby instance, it is called multi-AZ DB instance deployment. It provides failover support, but does not serve read traffic. The second option that we have is 2 readable standby instances, which is also called multi-AZ DB cluster deployment. It provides failover support and can also serve read traffic. So let's see how it looks like. The deployment option comes with 2 different cluster level management endpoints. The multi-AZ DB cluster uses the endpoint mechanism to abstract connections so that you don't need to specify exactly with DB instance in the DB cluster to connect to. So you don't have to hardcode all the host names or write your own logic for rerouting connections when some of the DB instances aren't available. The writer endpoint connects to the writer DB instance of the cluster, which supports both read and write operations. The reader endpoint connects to either of the 2 reader DB instances, which supports read-only operations. And also we have the reader with the reader endpoints, right? Whenever your application connects to reader endpoint and it serves the read traffic, behind the scenes, using the reader endpoint, RDS distributes the load between both the reader instances in a round-robin fashion, so it can scale your reads between both the reader instances. In addition to that, the multi-AZ cluster deployments, we also have instance level endpoints that connects to specific DB instance within the DB cluster. While connected to the specific DB instances, you can examine that specific instance levels, status variables or metrics, and so on. This can help you determine what's happening for the DB instance that's different from what's happening for other DB instances in the cluster. So whenever you're troubleshooting some of the issues, if you want to identify a specific problem, you can use those instance level endpoints and identify what's really happening within that individual cluster. And probably you can use those for a specific use cases, like if you want to have a specific workload repoint to a specific RDS instance within the cluster, you can also leverage that instance level endpoints. Now we will dive into a bit more about how the deployment option works under the hood. As you'll see on the screen, we have a primary DB instance in AZ1 and then 2 read replicas in AZ2 and AZ3. And if you observe the compute node, there have an attached SSD drives to that instance. So whenever your application writes a transaction to AZ1, which is our primary instance using our cluster endpoint, first it writes to the local disk and the primary, and it sends the transactions to both the standbys. So once both the standbys or readable standbys receives this transaction, we will wait for at least 1 reader DB instance needs to send us an acknowledgement. So once we receive the acknowledgement, we will commit the transaction on the primary instance. And In the background, asynchronously, right? We have the transaction on the local SSD drives. We will flush them to Amazon EBS volumes for the durable storage. So that's how the whole write path looks like in the multi-AZ cluster with 2 readable standbys looks like. Then, if you're using a reader endpoint from your application, reads will pull from the memory or from the EBS volume, depending on where your data lives on at the moment of the query. With this option, we use a different instance types that use local SSD storage. Currently, multi-AZ DB cluster only support M5D, M6GD, R5D, R6GD, and X2, IE, and DB instance classes. If you look at the last point, right now, multi-AZDB clusters with 2 readable standbys supported on MySQL version 8.0.28 and later, and supported on Postgres versions 13.4 and later. So let's have a quick discussion on how the transactions work. I think we just covered how the transactions work. With multi-AZDB clusters, Amazon RDS replicates the data from WriterDB instance to both the ReaderDB instances using the DB engine native replication capabilities. When a change is made on the WriterDB instance, it sends to each ReaderDB instance. And acknowledgement from at least one of the reader instance is required for change to be computed on the primary instance. So during this process, right, there is no EBS involved in the transaction commit path. So that's why we would see better performance when we are doing the when we are using the multi-AZDB clusters with 2 readable standbys. So let's look at some of the performance benefits of multi-AZ cluster deployment. So here, it improves the write performance. We just talked about how the writes happens. With our internal testing on MySQL multi-AZ clusters versus multi-AZ DB instances, right? We have done the performance comparison, multi-AZ with 1 standby, multi-AZ with 2 readable standbys. As you see on the screens, right? As we increase the threads during our testing process, we got transactions per second is really went up. Almost it's 2 times increase in the transactions per second. We also observed P95 write latency reduced by about 2.5 times. So basically, the write performance of your application would really increase when we are using the multi-AZ with 2 readable standbys. And another advantage with multi-AZDB cluster is the failover times. So within 1 standby instance, normally, typically, when there is a failover happens, typically you would see 60 to 120 seconds because it has to go through database recovery process, and then it has to bring the DNS changes, updates, and then it has to give it has to be served to the application. With 2 readable standbys option, we have observed typically the failover time takes 35 seconds due to there is no crash recovery step because our 2 readable standbys are already serving read traffic, right? They're already up and running. So we don't need to go through the database recovery process. That's why our failover times increased drastically. So with our internal testing, we have observed typically under 35 seconds. So the increased availability and fault tolerance offered by the multi-AZ DB cluster deployments makes them a natural fit for production environments. With that, I will pass it on to Krishna, who is going to cover what's new with the multi-AZ DB clusters, and we will end the session with the demo.
Thanks, Vijay. We have looked into RDS multi-AZ options and the RDS multi-AZ DB clusters with 2 readable standbys and its advantages. So let's now look into 2 new features that are added to multi-AZ DB cluster with 2 readable standbys. The first feature, which supports inbound read replica. So multi-AZ DB cluster now supports inbound read replica. So what it means? So if you are currently using RDS single AZ or multi-AZ DB instance, and to migrate to multi-AZ DB cluster with two readable standbys, you could use multiple migration options. The one option being you can take a snapshot and restore that snapshot to multi-AZ DB cluster. And the second option would be you can use DMS to replicate the changes from single AZ or multi-AZ DB instance deployment to multi-AZ DB cluster deployment, right? And with this new feature, you can also use this as a third migration option. So where you can add multi-AZ DB cluster as a read replica using this inbound read replica option, and then you can fail over at the time of the cutover, right? And let's now look into the second new feature, which is outbound read replica, right? And this is to support outbound read replicas that are either in single AZ or multi-AZ mode, deployment mode. So if your application is highly read intensive and you're looking to scale out horizontally using additional read replicas, so with this new feature, you can add up to additional 15 async read replicas that are either in single AZ or multi-AZ DB instance deployment mode. So this enables your read heavy workload to elastically scale out horizontally. So with that, I'm going to move on to a demo part. So where we're going to look into the first demo, which is going to talk about the migration option using inbound read replica. So in this case, what you're looking at is a database instance called PGDB1, which was deployed with multi-AZ DB instance deployment mode. And in this demo, we're going to look into how to migrate our database multi-AZ DB instance to a multi-AZ DB cluster with two readable standbys deployment mode using the new feature inbound read replica, right? So in this case, as you can see here, what I'm doing here is, first step, I'm going to add read replica, which you can do, by the way, using CLI or UI, right? And you're going to provide DB instance identifier and give the instance class and storage and the deployment mode, the availability option as multi-AZ DB cluster, and you come all the way down and you create read replica, right? So what's happening here is, so we have added inbound read replica, which is multi-AZ DB replica cluster in this case. And as you can see, it is in creating state. And let's give it some time. Yep, there you go. So our cluster is available at the moment, as you can see here, read replica cluster. And as you can see, you just make sure the replica is in sync. And at the time of the cutover, you can either use UI or CLI, and you can simply detach and promote the read replica in this case. So in this case, I'm using UI, and you can go to actions and say promote read replica, which is going to detach your multi-AZ DB replica cluster, and it's going to promote it for you. And once it is promoted successfully, you can go back and update application configuration and point your application to the new database endpoint that belongs to your multi-AZ DB cluster with two readable standbys. So this is going to give you obviously two endpoints. One is, as Vijay mentioned, you can either use the writer endpoint for writes and reads, and for read scaling capability, you can take advantage of these two additional read replicas using reader endpoint. So this demo pretty much talks about using inbound read replica, how you can able to migrate your existing multi-AZ or single AZ deployment to multi-AZ DB cluster deployment option with a very minimal downtime. So with that, I'm going to move on to the second demo, which we're going to talk about outbound read replica here. So with the outbound read replica, if you have heavy read intensive workload and you want to scale out your read intensive workload horizontally, you can add up to 15 read replicas like we discussed. So let's look into the demo, how we can do that. So you can use either UI, CLI, right? And in this case, I'm using UI. And in this case, I have my multi-AZ DB cluster with one writer and two readable standbys, right? And you're going to go to the actions and create read replica. And when you're creating the read replica, you can give the DB instance identifier and you give the corresponding instance configuration. the instance class, whether it is X large to X large, and multi-AZ, single AZ, and the DB subnet group, and then create read replica. So once you create the read replica, as you can see here, so additional replica is been added to our cluster configuration, which can be used for scaling out your reads in your cluster configuration. So this is the demo pretty much, talks about scaling out your reads using outbound read replicas. So this pretty much concludes, both the demos using inbound on outbound read replicas, one for easy migration path with a minimal downtime. The second one is to scale out your reads using additional read replicas in multi-AZ DB cluster mode. So with that, I'm going to move on to the next slide for the next steps. So if you're interested, of course, you can use RDS console. Please explore multi-AZ DB cluster configuration mode. And also, we have included some reference links here for you for a deep dive. So a few blogs that talks about multi-AZ with 2 readable stand-based configuration in a deep dive, and also included a customer use case from reInvent session. So we highly encourage you to go through these and do a deep dive to understand the features of multi-AZ DB clusters and the performance advantages. So with that, I would like to thank you for joining the session with us today and open up the session for you for Q&A. Thank you.